Well, hi there, Arthur. Great to be speaking with you again.
Likewise, glad to be with you again. It's always
Um,
been via Zoom. One day we'll be in the same room together somewhere, sometime.
yes, I look forward to that. Well, yeah, and last time we spoke, your films were on the Criterion Collection.
Hmm.
Now, we have this beautiful three Blu-ray set that Kino Lorber have just released, and which I've been enjoying. Um, What does it mean to you to have your life in film kind of collected in this way, in this beautiful set?
It's nothing that I had ever anticipated happening, especially with the great shifts of how media is being consumed these days, from streaming and physical media is such a strange kind of animal because we're all streaming these days. Even the Academy is streaming. I mean, we still have live screenings, yes, and that's paramount. But most of us are streaming material online just because of the access. And uh, for Kino Lorber to commit themselves to physical media uh, towards the my collection, I'm it's a pretty cool. I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't really thought about it, but, and you're the first person to actually have asked me that question, and now I have to think about it. Um, it's I think it's pretty cool, and I have to say it's kind of remarkable because of the shifting tide of the business. You know how things are working. That there's a company that says no, physical media is critical. We need to have this because streaming is fine. And, as an Academy member, we used to get, screeners, on DVD and Blu-ray, but that stopped a few years ago for a lot of good reasons. But I miss having that physical media. I miss being able to put it in and watch it on my monitor at home. And with streaming, you can't rely on streaming. I mean, it comes and goes, right? At the owner's whim. If they feel like taking it down, it's gone. Whereas physical media, you have it. Something about it being tangible, I think. Uh, and it's like when I transition, it's interesting using that word transition these days, but when I segue from making films to writing books, I really, part of that's because books are so tangible and the user, the viewer, the reader can control it at his or her own pace. Same thing with physical media. You can control when you want to see it, where you want to see it, how you want to see it. Whereas streaming, you can't quite have that kind of control.
Yeah.
I think that's it. It's because it's tangible.
Mhm. And when we spoke last time, we talked a bit about your very first film, which you made with some of your classmates, which isn't included here, but your first sort of independently made film, Public, is which I think is a very exciting watch. I really enjoyed watching that, and it's a 2K restoration. So I guess you revisited the film for that. What was it like for you to revisit the film? And I guess I don't know whether you contextualized it in terms of what was to come later, because you made that film in 1970 when you were still at high
Yeah.
school.
When I was a kid, yeah, a teenager. And uh, well, it's never been available really to a general public because I use copyrighted material, particularly the music. It's a soundtrack from um, a Ligeti piece that was on the soundtrack of 2001. And I was never really able to release it because of that. Uh, it's been shown at festivals on a one-off basis, and we always had to be aware of the copyright issues, and screenings would have to be contextualized in that this is a part of my work, and I'm there to present it and talk about it. So there's a fair use aspect to it. But then Kino Lorber, when they were putting this collection together, I said, well, there's this film that I'm rather proud of that really means a lot to me in terms of my work today still. And so the lawyers looked at it and says, well, if you can get a new score, we can justify its fair useness in terms of the visuals, because I pretty much cobble together and recreate and interpret the images in a way that falls under fair use. So the lawyers went through and said, well, create a new score. So that's what I did. And I was able to work with Mark Adler, who had scored 4 of my other films. And I said, listen, Mark, this is kind of not quite what we've done before because of the form. It's animated, it's kind of visceral, it's uh, uh, in it's very violent in some ways. What do you think? And I said, take a look at it. And he said, whoa, because he said, I made my first film at the same age you were and during the same era. And he said, I can totally understand what you're trying to do with this film. And he jumped right into it. And I said, well, I don't have much money because it's just kind of like, it's kind of a luxury. He goes, that's not why he would be doing it. And he called upon some of his musician friends and particularly singers, because there were voices in the original track, and created this really stirring kind of rough piece that's very different from Mark Adler's scores for my films. And we put it together. And it's, I, whenever I've shown it recently, or in just the past 40 years, whenever I do get a opportunity to show it, I always contextualize it and put it in terms of how young I was and the time period, especially the early 70s, and what was going on in San Francisco at that time, which was, a cultural revolution that was going on in the 70s. And this film is very much a piece from that period, but also it reflects really, like you said, very much what I've continued to do in my work, and that is to explore the issue of oppression, of social justice, of sexuality, and violence in our society. So for me, it really speaks to the continuation of what I've been doing for the last, well, long time, 50 years almost. Yeah,
And
so
counting, yeah.
so I really like the fact that now it can be shown and
Yes.
seen to not just at festivals, but now it's on this piece of physical media.
Yeah. And you've made one narrative short film. I mean, I know documentaries can be narrative, but just to distinguish between documentaries and a non-documentary film. But otherwise, you've really squarely focused on making documentaries. What has been the draw for you of the documentary as a form, as a filmmaking form, storytelling form?
Uh, because they're based on real life stories. But as a filmmaker, I'm able to then craft this real life story into a documentary and use elements of art, sound, picture, rhythm, and to really heighten the story, the real life story. For me, it's always about the story first. It's always the story that excites me. Like, okay, what is it about the story that really motivates me to spend maybe 5 years on developing, fundraising, and finally production and into post-production and then into distribution. So it has to really grab me in terms of some emotional journey that these real stories go through. But then once that grabs me, it's the creative process of, well, how then do I bring this story to life on the screen? So I think that's why documentaries have always been a draw for me. And it's not that I'm not interested in narrative live action film either, but it's just that there are just so many great stories to be told that I haven't had time to stop and say, okay, let's stop doing that and let's do this other form, right?
And talking about, things maybe not being available on streaming, and now of course we have on Blu-ray Outrage 69, which I'd never had chance to watch before, so I was really happy to see that that was part of this collection. And so that was part one of a four-part series.
The question of equality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about how you came to make the film? Yeah.
Well, what's interesting with Outrage 69 is that it had been the Question of Equality series was a four-part series produced by Testing the Limits, a very important company, a production company in the 80s and 90s, focused on bringing the story or the conflict of AIDS into the public, the general public, and really bringing that to the forefront so that a wider audience understands what's going on with the fight against AIDS. And they were given this grant from ITVS to do what would be PBS's first series, a multi-part series on LGBT rights and the community. So they invited me to produce episode one, which was essentially to be based on the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969. And they handed me over that idea. And from there, there had been other documentaries on the Stonewall Rebellion before and books, and which told the story from particular points of view. As I started researching the story, what grabbed me was the story of the internal conflicts. And at that time, when we were making the documentaries in the mid-90s, the coalition between lesbians and gay men was still not happening. It was still butting heads, and it wasn't fluid. And there's still some of that today, but it wasn't as fluid as it is today. But there was certainly butting heads. And women had their issues, men had their issues, and sometimes they overlap, oftentimes they didn't. And it caused conflict even in the 90s. And with Outrage 69, I was able to really look at that period of time when that was very much an issue. But not only between genders, but also between classes and races. And I chose to focus on that as the story for this series. Not that the overall fight for rights wasn't the most important story, but I found that the struggle between classes and races and genders was equally important to tell and explore, because it had never been explored via the Stonewall Rebellion before. And to understand, well, what is it? I think it's because the 90s, the issue between the genders, between lesbians and gay men was so prevalent. I said, well, was that always the case? And that's what drew me to explore that in Outrage 69. And then the divisions of classes and race really came up as well, very strongly, and that's what I focused that documentary on. So I was hoping to tell that point of view of the story. And I'll tell you, I got some flack for it, but yeah, that's okay. That's good. Basically the white men who were part of that era really didn't like what I did. I mean, they were very vocal about it. And I said, well, that may not be your truth, but it is the truth of those people that I talked to. That was their truth. And we need to acknowledge that and know about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what's so terrific now is because the series itself had not been available after its initial distribution on VHS. And I still, it was produced in 1994 up to up to today, I still get occasional requests for it and questions about it and requests for the archival material that I shot, particularly interviews of the participants and like Sylvia Rivera. And but it was never available. So I said, you know what, for this collection, I spoke to the producer of the series, the collection, Rob Sweeney. I said, this is an important part of my work. It's an important part of the documentaries that were made about the Stonewall Rebellion. Let's try to get that. And we were able to locate the original producers of the series, and she gave us permission to include it into the collection. So at least one out of the 4 episodes is now available for general public to watch. So I'm excited about that, and grateful that the people at Testing Limits gave us the okay and released the documentary for the collection.
Yeah, it was as nice. You mentioned Sylvia Rivera, and it was great to see a quite expansive. I mean, I know the whole thing is only 55 minutes, but the interview with her is quite expansive. And I think the speech that she gives in Washington Square, that's sort of a longer clip, the longest clip I've seen of it actually, and some footage of it I hadn't seen before. And I hadn't seen her reflect back on the speech. Uh,
Mhm. And
so
she looked great,
yeah,
because
yeah.
in her later years, she had a lot of difficulty surviving, and I haven't seen all of the interviews of her, but I think that was one of the last interviews where she wasn't living in difficult times. She was settled. It was She was in Westchester, um, and she was having a great time. There was that was the year of the gay pride. I don't think it's even called a gay pride parade or march in New York, but was it the anniversary? I think it was an anniversary of the Stonewall Rebellion in '94. Is that correct? Or '93? Or
The 23.
25th anniversary, I think, right?
Yeah,
Or something. Anyway, I have to do the math.
yeah,
But she was in great spirits. She led. There were 2 parades that year. I don't know if you remember. You were in London, I think, right?
yeah,
Probably. But there were 2 parades. One, the general kind of the gay pride parade, and then there was the outliers, the folks led by Sylvia Rivera, saying, wait a minute, that is not a part of our story, which is exactly what we were talking about and trying to explore in Outrage 69. And so she led a second parade, which I marched with her, yeah, because that's where I belong. Not in the other. I mean, I belong in the other parade too, but that's where my sentiments were during that time. So it was a great interview. I remember very clearly that interview that day, and yeah, we had a great time. Yeah, I'm happy to say that that was my memory of Silvia Rivera.
and I mean, I've seen a lot of films about Stonewall and about the early gay rights movement and the post-Stonewall gay rights movement, but it's quite rare that we see Asian Americans included in it. So that's something that's significant about this film too. And we see the sign at the Pride Parade, Asian American, gay and proud. So I don't
Yeah,
really.
that was well, because they being Asian American and gay Asian American. I was out. Was I out in '69? Kind of out. But anyway, '69 was a long time ago, and I was what, 16? No, I was 14, right? But I remember all that. Particularly, I remember the era of the whole hippie cultural revolution in San Francisco, and uh, and I was a part of that. And so in making Outrage 69, I really sought out, okay, who else was there? It wasn't, because there's always this accusation, not accusation, but um, this idea that the gay rights movement was always white and male. I said, no, 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 I was there. I mean, so it was wonderful when we discovered that Kyoshi was a part of the Gay Liberation Front, and to have voices like Ron Ballard and Cadence Boyce, African Americans be a part of the documentary and giving them a voice, and to have Carla Jane, important member of the Lavender Menace, be an important part of the documentary as well, and Joan Nessel. And we had the white guys too, sure, but we've heard from them before. But to put all of them together in context, in terms of how they in terms of their interrelationships, was important for me, and then to see where we were as a community and how that reflects on us as in terms of where we are at today.
Yeah.
And today meaning the mid 90s.
Yes.
At the time.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a different, I mean, it's different today.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
We still have our struggles. And I was actually interesting with Anita Bryant having passed away at the end of last year to see how that's contextualized in the film, because I think now a lot of people would probably just, focus on the negative element. But it's interesting in your film, someone mentions, well, that her rhetoric and campaign was kind of a shot in the arm, someone says in the film, to help sort of reunite the LGBTQ community and the movement as well. So
yeah, she died a day or two ago, or within this last
yes,
week.
I think we heard. I think it was mid-December actually, but I think
It
we
was in
only
mid-December
about it.
she passed
Yeah.
away. But just the news now, and
Yes.
I've seen some of the coverage of her death, and what's often used is her with pie in the face, right? And it's funny. It's not funny, but it is funny. It is, but that's not the whole story. It's not just she's not just a joke, and she wasn't a joke. And I was happy to be able to include her as part of that larger story. And in terms of the religious right, the moral majority, which is what it was called back then, how they have gained strength through the decades to the threat that they are today.
Yeah.
A very real threat. And I think that's the work I wanted to continue to do in Family Fundamentals, in that to say, wait a minute, they're not just some small group that we can brush aside because we say, well, we're gay and proud. It's not enough to say we're gay and proud. We really have to deal with this more majority conservative right, Christian right, and their movement. Because if we don't, they're going to just grow stronger. And what we've seen as an Outrage 69, it started with Anita Bryant, somewhat. I'm not going to give her all the credit. And leading up to the work in Family Fundamentals in 2002, when I produced that film. And there were still people in the community that rather not have watched Family Fundamentals. It was like, but I said, well, no, the threat is real. These folks are really strong, and they really need to be dealt with, whether we want to or not. And it's just not a matter of legislative rights. It's about what's in their minds and heart. That's the battle, because that's hard to win. We can win in the voting booth. We can win bills. We can get legislation passed. But if we don't get to the hearts and the minds and their spiritual beliefs, we're not completing the battle. We're not going to win the war. And we see that today. We have not won the war, and we're losing far too many battles, when you would think, with our strength and the numbers, we should have gone further than that today, but we haven't. And it's scary.
So obviously, I find it fascinating to talk to you in more depth about the films, and I think one of the great things about this Blu-ray collection is that alongside the films, there's 4 hours of bonus footage, which I feel kind of continues the conversation, gives people more insight. So, what was your approach to assembling that part of this set?
Well, actually, it was kind of satisfying, because with each documentary, there was just so much more material that couldn't fit into a single piece of work. But that's the luxury of research, right? In each of my films, I revel in the research, and I think this partly that's why I love making documentaries. It gives me a chance to really dive deeply into a subject matter that I'm curious about, and but this all this extra material. What do you do with it? I'm lucky that for two of my films, I was able to write books and put a lot of that research into the books, Hollywood Chinese and Forbidden City, USA, both visual in terms of, and also the stories that were told to me that weren't included in the final productions. But there are the other films that have all this material as well. So when I was working with Rob, the producer of the collection at Kino Lorber, he goes, well, how much time do I have in this extra disc? And he goes, well, we can put up to 4 hours. And that was a challenge because I have much more than 4 hours. But, not everybody's going to really want to see everything. But it gave me a chance to really look at each title, look at the available work, and put in things that weren't in the film. Uh, I think one of my favorite additions is an interview with Pat Bond. She's a lesbian World War II veteran. We had interviewed her just prior to her passing of cancer. And the interview didn't quite work. Her energy was, she was under treatment. So we didn't end up using her story in the final film Coming Out in the Fire about World War II vets. And we also knew that she played a prominent role, had a prominent voice in Word Is Out. So her story was there and we felt, okay, her story's there. We don't have to feel so like guilty about not including her in the final film. But her story was still just heart wrenching. And so to be able to include her story in the as one of the bonus features was terrific. And on the opposite end, I proposed to go to the St. Cloud Correctional Center, which is right outside of the center, to interview Jay Johnson, one of the killers I featured in License to Kill. And he was a serial killer that killed gay men because he wanted to cleanse himself of being gay and cleanse the world of AIDS. So I was given special permission by the prison warden to show the film to him in prison. This is very unusual. And then interview him afterwards. And I think it's about a 10, 15-minute interview. And I put it together as part of my work as a visiting artist and showed it at the center during that time. And this is in the late 90s. But I haven't really shown it since. And it was part of my DVD of License to Kill, but that was about it. So I said, I think this is important to share, to hear what he thought about seeing himself as well as the other killers in License to Kill, and how their stories were portrayed, how he felt about, just in hindsight, his crimes and how he survived in prison all these years. So that's in the collection as well.
Yeah. And I think something that he says speaks to the larger part of what you were saying in the film, something that's quite disturbing when he says that, killing a gay man is in prison, from his experience, was seen as sort of a neat crime and a kind of acceptable crime, and kind of cool. I
Yeah,
mean, great
yeah.
killing,
There were many times during my interview with him where he just surprises me by his own personal experience. And one is that, well, he had the AIDS virus, so people stayed away from him. But he also had the kind of, I don't know, reverence, you would say, because he killed gay men, and other prisoners thought that was a kind of a neat, a cool crime to have committed because it was against the gay community. So it's an interesting interview, and it was a very, and what I appreciated was his honesty and his openness. And he has, prior to my interview with him for the documentary, and up to the time I interviewed him for this visiting artist assignment, he had just stayed away from the media. He refused to give interviews, and we were able to talk about that as well. And I think this is where documentary filmmakers are important, in that his reasoning was because it wasn't just a 30-second soundbite
yeah.
from the local news station, that he knew that what we were trying to do was really explore the issue on different levels and give it time and not just cut it off at 30 seconds. And he felt confident and secure with what we were trying to do.
Yeah, talking about the bonus features, another one I was really pleased to see was an extended interview with BD Wong. And
Yeah.
I love that he talks in that about finding joy when he became a father in his identity as an Asian American and a gay man, which, and he can contrast that with when he was growing up. He didn't feel that, particularly because he didn't really see much representation. So yeah, maybe just talk a bit about wanting to include him in general in the film Hollywood Chinese, but then also being able to show us this sort of expanded interview with the bonus features.
But when I was putting together the possible interviewees for Hollywood Chinese, it's kind of like a casting process. And it's kind of, I guess I can use that word because it was. If we treat documentaries as a narrative, you do cast your characters. And I knew I wanted, if possible, a gay man to be a part of that story, that narrative. And at that time, the only really out and gay Asian or gay Chinese man at that time in the industry that was somewhat known was BD Wong. And even then at that time, he wasn't like out the way we know it now. That was it was a different time period. But he did speak at a GLAAD Awards dinner, and he spoke about being gay. He wrote a book about having a child with another man. So it wasn't like a secret. And so he agreed to be a part of the documentary. And in our interview, of course, we talk a lot about the history of the Chinese in Hollywood and the depictions and the erasure of our stories and image on the screen. But I knew I would eventually get to his personal story. And as with all the interviewees that I chose, I did want a personal point of view as well, a personal narrative as part of their journey in the film industry. And BD was so open and so generous in sharing his story, even beyond what I thought would be coming forth and what I needed for the documentary. And we included a part of it in the documentary, final documentary, but really not as much as we had on tape, on video. And when I was pulling together material for the collection, I revisited his interview and thought, well, here's the part of the story that really meant a lot to me personally as a gay Asian man in the industry. And really just his clear-headedness about his experience and his life story and his trajectory was so evident in the interview that I put that together and put as part of the bonus features. I don't know if he's seen it. I had to check in with him. I had to send him a copy and say, "Have you seen this, by the way?" He's fully supportive of the film, yes, and the book. So I'm not sure if he's seen the bonus clip though.
Yes.
I have to check in on him.
And we also get an essay about your work in as part of the set.
Yes.
Another great thing about physical media is that we get the inlays, and so that was great to read that Alonso wrote. And in that he quotes you as saying film is a weapon. In fact, I think the whole essay is called "Film is a Weapon." And that you were quoted as saying that in an interview from 1999, I think. So is that still the way that you view your work?
Yes, very much so. I think it's been tempered a little bit in terms of what we see as weapons. I mean, it's certainly not an armed piece of material, a gun or a blade, but it's more a weapon, a tool. I think I see it more as a tool, maybe perhaps if there was any kind of adjustment to that idea. But certainly a tool is a weapon. It's to help you gain your goals or work towards your goal. And for me, that's a more equitable society. That's always been the goal ever since I made my first film public when I was 16, was to look at this world that we live in and what is it that we need to work on so that we all have equal opportunity and we're on equal footing uh, and free of oppression and discrimination. So yeah, film is a weapon. Film is a tool, and I remember though reflecting on that idea when Matthew Shepard was murdered in 1998, I believe it was. And this is a year after I had finished License to Kill, which focused on killers of gay men. I I remember distinctly when I first heard the news of Shepard's death, I just felt deflated. And I felt, well, all this work that I thought I was doing didn't amount too much because Matthew Shepard still got murdered. But I think I I got away from that feeling right away and rethought my ideas about how effective creative work can be in terms of social change. But I remember being deflated. I said, well, this weapon, I guess it didn't work. It wasn't very useful. But soon, I kind of got out of that self-centered kind of self-pity. I don't know what you want to call that, but I got out of that mode and I realized that it may not be, the changes aren't going to come overnight. It takes time. And what I've learned is that my work, and I'm very grateful for this, still has a place in conversations about how we see each other in this world, how we relate or don't relate in this world. And even with License to Kill, it's still a film that's being shown and used, and in that way. So change takes time. A weapon is a tool that needs to be refined and perhaps practiced with so that it can be effective or more effective. But Alonzo Duralde, the author of the essay, took great care in trying to encapsulate 45 years of work into several pages. He had limited space, and I remember reading the first draft. I said, "Oh wow, okay, cool." And Alonso's been around as a writer. He just wrote the Hollywood Pride book, so he was actually the perfect person that Kino Lorber assigned to write the essay. And he knew my work because I knew him from way back when he was in Texas with I think it was called the USA Film Festival, or the US Film Festival in Dallas. I had met him when he was the director of that festival way back a long time ago. So he had already known and followed my work. So he was a perfect person to write the essay. Yeah. And the booklet. The thing about physical media, you get things, right?
Yes.
I come from the old LP days where you have liner notes, the big liner notes, and I would love reading it, especially when the LP was a fold out, so you get extra stuff in it. So I come from that generation where it's just not about maybe the content of the LP or the disc, but it's also the context in which the creative work is done, is produced, and to hear what other people may have to say about it, and the pictures. I love when Rob, the producer of the collection, said, "Well, what ideas do you have for the cover of the Blu-ray?" So I picked out a few of my favorites, and they haven't been really used a lot because I didn't want to repeat some of the images. And we both decided on the final image of a pair of dancers, which is great. It's a beautiful image. It's a very rare image that I hadn't used a lot very much. We use it as the signature image of the Criterion retrospective, but that's pretty much it. And it just worked graphically. There are a lot of decisions to be made when you use an image for a cover, and it just worked in so many ways. And then and that was finalized, but then he asked for images for the booklet, which would include a filmography. And he wanted photos from each of my films, even if they're not in the collection. So I went through my archive of images again, and then I found this image of me with a camera taken in 1976. It's such I was going to say it's such a cliche kind of image, with the camera and the Super 8 camera, and it's done in a kind of artistic kind of way. But I said, no, it's kind of reflective of how I began my work, which was in the 70s. And I still feel that way about film, and the fact that the collection includes a Super 8 film, and the camera is a Super 8 camera, public, that it makes sense to have this as the image. So I'm glad with the booklet we put that as the cover image.
And as you mentioned, you've published several books, or you've written and several books have been published. What about another film? Is that something you're currently planning or working on?
I would. I'm waiting for the motivation to jump into another film, but in the meantime, I've been working on my third book, and I love the process of writing a book, because it ends up being tangible. It ends up being a physical entity that you can hold and look through. But more, I like the process. I think as a filmmaker, I've always been kind of a loner, which is why I edit my films, I write my own films, I produce my films. Certainly, the collaboration with the team, other creative personnel, people in the team is a wonderful process, and I thoroughly enjoy that and look forward to that with each film. But in the end, I really love my most favorite part of making film is in the edit room when it's just me and the material in a dark room and a screen, whether that be a movie OLED screen or today is a computer screen. And with writing, it's all about that. I mean, for most of it. And as a filmmaker, I've always been image driven. You know, I I I mentioned that story was primary for me, but very close to that requirement for me to jump into a film of having a good story is are there images? Yeah, that's almost as important as the story, because for me it's about the imagery. Uh, and so as a book writer, I've been focused on picture books. I think they call them coffee table books, right? But image for me, they're image driven books where for me, I wouldn't jump into a book, I don't think yet, unless there were images. So, and then the writing part is just like editing, and I'm editing with words and picture. When I'm working on, typically for most book writers, they do the text and they hand that over to the publisher and they hire a designer. And then you hand them, if there are going to be images, all the images that the designer can put together with the text. The way I'm writing is I've learned how to use InDesign, a publishing software, and I'm writing with pictures and words simultaneously. I might write the text for a section, but then go off to look through my archive of images and say, okay, what images do I have to support that story, and vice versa, and edit the two together so that they flow together. And that's the process I'm going through now with my most current book. And I love it. It's just, I'm laying out the book, but I will have a book designer to make it beautiful because I I'm not skilled enough to do that, but at least I'm laying out the text along with the images, what images I want to have full page or a spread or just a small image, how much of text I need for the image to survive, or will it survive in the caption? And it's elongated caption perhaps, and not part of the text. It's for me, it's a creative process that I didn't think I would experience, but so to answer your question, I'm busy writing my third book, and but I do, when I was putting together material for the collection, I had to do some editing. I said, "Oh yeah, I missed this. I miss
Yeah.
editing and putting together images and clips to create a story." So I said, well, "Okay," but for now, that inspiration I know will come. I'll recognize it when it comes. Hopefully, well, or maybe it's another book. I don't know.
Yeah.
Either way, it's okay.
What's the focus of the current book that you're putting together?
It's called Grandview Film, and Grandview Film was a company that was started by a Chinese American filmmaker in 1931 in San Francisco, Chinatown. Long story short, he ended up making hundreds of films, both in Hong Kong and in San Francisco, Chinatown, in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And it's a story not very well known. Some film historians in Hong Kong have written about him. And I wrote a chapter about the filmmaker. His name is Joseph Sunju in my Hollywood Chinese book. I think it's about 10 pages, but mostly images. But since then, I've done more research. I've collected more material, so much more material. I have thousands of images now based on his work. And it's a wonderful story that hasn't really been told. And I'm excited about it because I think partly it's because when I first began making films in the 70s, he was still alive. I didn't know about him. When I went to film school in the 80s, he was still alive, but I didn't know about him. And I think it would have made a difference for me to know that someone who started in the neighborhood I grew up in, San Francisco, Chinatown, where he was making feature films in the 40s about Chinese Americans in color in 16 millimeter. It's just astounding when I think about what I missed knowing, when I think I would have been I know I would have been very inspired by him. Not that I wasn't inspired by other filmmakers, but to know that he lived and did his work 3 blocks away from where I grew up in a warehouse would have really said to me, pushed me even further into pursuing my career in film.
Yeah. As you mentioned it, I have to just ask a follow-up of which filmmaker or filmmakers you were particularly inspired by, or you have been throughout your career.
Well, what's interesting is, Jenny Olsen. She's a historian, curator, filmmaker. She is very much involved in making sure the work of Arthur Bressan is restored, preserved, and shown and distributed. A filmmaker from the 1970s, a gay filmmaker. And I don't know why Jenny and I were exchanging emails or talking. I'm not sure what it was, but Arthur Bressan came up. I said, "Oh yeah, I know Arthur." He goes, "Bressan, no." And she goes, "You what?" I said, "Oh yeah, well, I dated his boyfriend back in, gosh, it was in the mid 70s. We were working, his boyfriend Aaron and I were working as clerks at Takahashi, a kind of high-end chic gift store in San Francisco that no longer exists. And he was dating Arthur. And then Aaron and I started dating. So then, I mean, it was the 70s, right?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. It's the 70s, yeah.
Okay. And there was,
yeah.
That's what people did.
Yeah.
And then one night we had somehow Arthur organized a kind of show and tell evening of films. And I showed public, and Arthur showed some of his super. It was all Super 8 films, and that's when we met. And he really was excited about public and wanted to have. He said encouraged me to enroll in at Hampshire College, which at the time was just starting on the East Coast. It was kind of uh, radical kind of lefty kind of school where you created your own curriculum. He goes, yeah, send your film to so and so, and I'm sure you'll get a scholarship and admission. And at that time, I was looking at colleges because I was still in high school, but that never worked out. But I got to know Arthur, and and we lost contact after I didn't see Aaron anymore, and but always was aware of his filmmaking. And as an independent filmmaker, working in San Francisco outside of the industry, and was very much inspired by what he did with his career. Um, so Arthur was a pretty key inspiration for me in the very beginning. From there, my inspirations were Stanley Kubrick. He was um, and I still study his work. I don't make films like him, but just the fact that he's an artist and he's kind of quirky, he just like me, I like to work alone. He has boundaries on his privacy, and he has his creative process that some people may not agree with, but because of his work, they look aside and say, doesn't matter. We love his work, so we'll work together. Stanley Kubrick was an inspiration from the very beginning and still is.
Well, last time we spoke, I asked you a very broad question for your favorite piece of LGBTQ plus culture, and we ended up talking about a Peking opera star, Mei Lan Fang, who
Mm-hmm.
was influential to you as a youngster. So, because we spoke about about that last time, I'll reframe the question and just ask you, narrow it, and ask you for your favorite LGBTQ plus film. So, something that's, maybe had an impact on you, resonated with you, um, and stayed with you over the years, or if there's something that you've seen more recently that's made an impact on you, perhaps you would pick that. So I'll leave that up to you, but something LGBTQ plus in the film world, documentary or a narrative film.
Can I give you bookends?
Yes.
I can give you bookends. From the beginning, word is out. It was the first time, and I was still in high school, and I saw it in the theater because, of course, that time you had to see films in the theater, um, uh, and uh, and it was the first time it was Dennis, the Chinese American man in the film. It was the first time I seen an out Chinese American man speak about being gay in a very nonchalant, casual way. And I remember seeing that in the midst of all the other stories, Pat Bond, the other characters, women and men and trans. And it was wonderful to see this collection of voices. And I'm thinking, had I come out yet by that time? I don't quite remember. I had to look at the timeline, but it was just in the beginning of me working in film with public. And in high school, I was in high school, and it was very important for me to see that film in the theater with other people. And that had an impact to say, this is good. Documentaries, LGBT characters in film, sure. Real life people, yes, that works. Chinese American, that's there too. It's worked on, for me personally, on so many levels. And to see that these personal stories and told through on-camera interviews, that the on-camera interviews was art in itself. And throughout my work, I tried to hone that skill and say, okay, on-camera interviews, yes, for some, they're a bore, but for me, no, it's a very unique art form where you look at the facial expressions, the voices. For me now, I can kind of decipher the skill of the interviewer, where the interviewer is coming. Oftentimes it works, many times it doesn't, because I'm being now oftentimes a subject of interviews. Just with all due respect, and not including you, I in my analysis or critique, I can tell when a film interviewer hasn't done their homework and they're just superficial and I'm just bored and I'm not this interview though. I want to you've done your homework, which and and you care. Whereas I don't know how often you're a subject of an interview, but I can tell when it's just they're just doing the job and nothing more, which is okay. And I do those too because you know you have to sometimes. So Word is Out taught me that there's an art to interviewing a person, both as a audience member and as a filmmaker. The other end is Emilia Perez. Is that the film? Is it Emilia or just Emilia? Is it Emilia Perez?
Yeah, Emilia Perez. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, from the very beginning of my love of film, I first probably loved musicals. So I'm a music. I mean, I still go to musicals on live musicals. I mean, I love musicals, and whether they're serious or frivolous or everything in between. I just love going to musicals or watching musicals. So to see a film like Emilia Perez with this full scope of characters and it being a musical, and as a filmmaker, just reveling in this revolutionary concept. And uh, I'm not sure how long that film's going to stick with me, but it's sticking with me. So those are my two bookends. Word is Out, Emilia Perez. And in between, I would probably want to throw in Maria. I'm sorry. I'm an opera lover too. I
Oh,
just
as another more recent one. Yeah, Maria
yeah,
from this year.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Emilia Perez because of this audacity
Hmm.
and the fact that the main character is a transgendered woman
Yeah.
is really quite lovely.
Well, Arthur Dong, thanks so much. A delight to talk to you again. And yes, I'm very, as you said, very much interested and an admirer of your work. So it was a pleasure to speak to you again.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Is Thanks for taking an interest. It's I appreciate that.